Good morning, Austin Oaks Church. How are you all doing this morning? Good morning, Linda. Good to see you. Virtually see you. Good to have you all this morning as you're starting to trickle in on a beautiful, sunshiny day. It is South Texas, so that's a pretty typical morning, isn't it? Hope you're all doing well. We're going to continue in Acts today. Acts 23, we're in this chapter on Wednesday as well. I'm doing back-to-back this week, so we're going to take a look at another slice of this chapter that's actually really fascinating. I know, I'm inside. It is kind of messing things up, isn't it? You're not going to hear the birds chirping. Actually, I'm not even at my place. We're out of town this weekend, actually celebrating my youngest son. Tanner turned 21 this week, so a big birthday for him. And so we're all gathering up here at a friend's place on Lake LBJ. Our whole family's coming up, and we're going to spend a couple days together just celebrating his birthday and playing and enjoying each other's company. So super excited about that. We have all 5 of our kids are coming up, plus our daughter's husband, Will. Is coming up. Yes, happy birthday, Tanner. Very much so. Is coming up, and then some of Tanner's friends. So we'll have the whole gang here having a good time. So I was out in the yard setting up cornhole. I got some spike ball going. I picked up a wiffle ball set. We're going to have a little water football. So we're going to create some McCartney Olympics. So we're going to draw names out of hats, team up, and we're going to compete against each other and probably be talking a lot of smack. I'm sure that's surprising to all of you that might happen. So it's going to be fun to have everyone together. Maggie, good morning. So, hey, let's jump in, get rolling on this. Here's kind of where we're going to go today. As I put in here, God's unique sovereign plan. I want to just see as we walk through the rest of chapter 23. So we're going to start in verse 12. Is where the story is going to pick up. But I want to just read verse 11 because verse 11 is kind of a hinge verse in this chapter. If you remember, if you were with us on Monday, we saw kind of the debate that was going on as Paul's been somewhat arrested now. The Jews have been trying to basically eliminate him and just get rid of him. And now some Roman guards are protecting him because Paul's a Roman citizen. So he's being protected by these guards, and they were in the midst of this huge controversy between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sanhedrin, which were the leaders, were accusing Paul of teaching false things, and it wasn't true, but they just wanted to get rid of him altogether. So that's what was going on. But Paul gets rescued by these Roman soldiers. And now we're going to see in the course of the book of Acts, this last part of the book of Acts, is God is going to fulfill his sovereign plan for the gospel through Paul's life in a very unique way. He's said that he wanted to obviously bring the gospel from Jerusalem to the Gentile world. And that's what's going to happen through these events, these what look like, and they are horrible circumstances for Paul in many ways. They're phenomenal circumstances for the gospel. And how God uses them to accomplish his sovereign plan. And I think we can relate that to our lives personally at times, and even to our current events of this time. So let's jump in and take a look. So verse 11 starts like this. After Paul's been taken by the guards again out of this kind of controversial situation with the Jewish leaders, it says, the following night, the Lord stood by him and said, have courage. For as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so it is necessary for you to testify in Rome. So this is God's sovereign plan. He gives Paul this sovereign message. But what's interesting, and I think we all need to be reminded of this is at least the last recorded episode that we see God clearly speaking to Paul and telling him this. He goes through years of being in prison by the Romans, house arrest, as we're going to see through these different seasons. And we don't see any more specific episodes of God speaking to him directly like this. He just has to move forward based on what God has revealed to him. So Paul experiences some very difficult seasons and doesn't necessarily have a direct word from God as we often want to have in those seasons. And I think that can be true for many of us, that in our darkest, most difficult seasons, sometimes it seems like God's silent in our lives, but he's not. He might not be speaking at that moment, but he's probably spoken to us a truth that he's already communicated to us, and he's speaking to us through his word. He may just feel distant because of our circumstances, but he's not. He's still active and engaged in our lives, and we see that here with Paul. So let's talk about what happens here in this this story of Paul and how we can learn from it. So when it was morning, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who had formed this plot. These men went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a solemn curse that we won't eat anything until we have killed Paul. So now you, along with the Sanhedrin, make a request to the commander that he bring him down to you, as if you were going to investigate his case more thoroughly. But before he gets near, we are ready to kill him." But the son of Paul's sister, hearing about their ambush, came and entered the barracks and reported it to Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander, because he has something to report to him." So he took him, brought him to the commander, and said, "The prisoner Paul called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, because he has something to tell you." The commander took him by the hand, led him aside, and inquired privately, "What is it you have to report to me?" "The Jews," he said, "have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the Sanhedrin tomorrow, as though they are going to hold a somewhat more careful inquiry about him. Don't let them persuade you, because there are more than 40 of them lying in ambush, men who have bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they have killed him. Now they are ready, waiting for your consent." So the commander dismissed the young man and instructed him, "Don't tell anyone that you have informed me about this." He summoned 2 of his centurions and said, "Get 200 soldiers ready and 70 cavalry and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Also provide mounts to ride so that Paul may be brought safely to Felix, the governor." He wrote the following letter: "Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. When this man had been seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them, I arrived with my troops and rescued him because I learned that he is a Roman citizen. Wanting to know the charge they were accusing him of, I brought him down before their Sanhedrin. I found out that the accusations were concerning questions of their law and that there was no charge that merited death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there was a plot against the man, I sent him to you right away. I also ordered his accusers to state their case against him in your presence." So the soldiers took Paul during the night and brought him to Antipus, as they were ordered. The next day, they returned to the barracks, allowing the cavalry to go on with him. When these men entered Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. After he read it, he asked what province he was from. When he learned he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will give you a hearing whenever your accusers also get here." He ordered that he be kept under guard in Herod's palace. So there's the story that we see here. And there's a lot of details in here that require some history and understanding to get what's going on. So I'll just summarize really simply that what's happened is, because the Jews in Jerusalem had stirred up this controversy with Paul. Remember, Jerusalem's under Roman authority, under Roman power right now. So the leaders in Jerusalem, the Roman soldiers in Jerusalem, were there to keep the peace. And so the Jews could only do so much under their own governing, that they also had to submit to the Roman laws. And so what's happened here is, since the Jews had stirred up this controversy, the Roman soldiers had stepped in, the Roman leaders had stepped in to protect Paul, because Paul was born a Roman citizen, so he has those citizenship rights. The Roman soldiers are protecting him. They realize there's a conspiracy. The Roman commander realizes Paul's a Roman citizen, so he has to be tried according to Roman law, which means he needs to be protected in this scenario. So what happens when this conspiracy comes up that's going to, where the Jews are trying to kill Paul, it causes this commander to send Paul to Caesarea, a Roman city or a Roman occupied city that's closer to Rome than obviously Jerusalem is. And in this whole journey of trials, Paul is going to continue to be moving from Jerusalem closer to Rome as he's a prisoner. So you see this phenomenal scenario that looks horrible on the outside, and it is difficult. It's very difficult. Paul's imprisoned. He's not in a good situation. He's falsely accused, but God's using it to accomplish his unique sovereign plan, a plan that would almost be impossible to carry out for Paul by himself without this, because God wanted Paul to testify before kings and leaders and rulers in Rome, in the whole Gentile world, the center of the Gentile world at that time, the Roman Empire. And what better way to do it than the way he's having him do it? His expenses were all covered. His travel was all covered. He was protected the whole way. And as he goes from Caesarea and lands in these different spots that he has to go to before he gets to Rome, everywhere he goes, Paul gets to share his case of what he's being accused of. And he's being accused of believing in the resurrection. That's what he's being accused of. So Paul gets to testify. He gets to share the gospel in a court of law everywhere he travels. I just think that's phenomenal to see this situation that looks bad on the outside, but is accomplishing God's unique sovereign plan on the inside. And here's my point for you today, and then we're gonna just tease this out a little bit and even see how we see it today. Is what looks like a detour to us is a sovereign detail to God. I think most of you could probably testify of this. In fact, shoot something into your comments if you can think of a time in your life that looked like a detour that later you realized was a sovereign detail in God's plan. Something that completely didn't go the way you had thought, but ended up being an incredibly valuable tool and detail in God's plan for your life, as well as oftentimes for others. I think that's what we have to remember, is we can become so individualistic that we wonder, hey, this stuff isn't working out for my best interest. But our best interest, at least in how we see it as humans, isn't always God's top priority. In an eternal sense, absolutely, he wants our best interest. But we sometimes have a selfish best interest that's about our comfort, it's about our success, it's about all the things that we desire. But that doesn't always help us become the most effective in God's plan. And God has a bigger picture that often requires us to experience some loss and some difficulty and some challenges at times for the sake of others. I think we all can understand that, even if we're parents, how often we are willing to experience difficulty or struggle or even suffer ourselves for the sake of our children. That's very true of all of us. In fact, that's how we express love in many ways, is by doing so. And God does the same thing and even expects the same thing from us. So he's doing that with Paul, and he's using Paul mightily in the big picture, but it's going to cost him some comfort in the meantime. So what looks like a detour to us is a sovereign detail in God's plan. So as I was thinking about this morning, an interesting story came to mind of a situation that happened several years ago when Carrie and I, when we were still living in Laredo, and we had just planned a small group. It was a group we were doing that was very outwardly focused. We were doing a series, I forget exactly what it was, but it was a series that was really talking about life's purpose, the purpose of life. and how God has a purpose for all of us. And it was very much focused on helping people who didn't know God at all come to know him. And so we decided we were going to invite a bunch of our neighbors who weren't believers at the time, invite them all to come over and try to start a group from scratch with just people in our neighborhood that didn't know Jesus. And so I was excited about it, a little nervous about it, of course. Had invited everyone. And then about a day or so before the group was to meet, a friend of mine from our church, Greg Jones is his name. He was an ICE agent in that area, so dealt with a lot of customs and various things, as well as on the enforcement side of customs. And they'd captured this guy who was importing textiles illegally, and doing it at a pretty high level crime he was involved in. But he had a network of connections with some people who were even higher up in it. And so they had him under house arrest, and they were kind of bargaining with him. If he would give certain information, they were going to reduce his crime. And so he was under house arrest at the time. And Greg, who was a believer, just a neat guy, had begun talking to the guy a little bit, developed a little bit of a relationship with him, and was able to give him some freedom, but he had to wear an ankle bracelet so that they knew where he was at all times, and he had to be under certain circumstances that he could move around. So Greg finds out I'm doing this group, and he says, "Hey, would you be okay if this guy came and joined you in this group?" I'm thinking, okay, we got this international criminal is going to come and join us. His name was actually Kamel Haddad. He was Middle Eastern. His family, his brother was the president of the Bank of Iraq. So some interesting connections this guy had, and he's running textiles through Mexico into the States. And so Greg convinces me to let this guy come to our group. And so he shows up in a taxi at our house. And my wife's a little concerned, thinking, okay, really, we're going to bring this guy into our home? Well, here's what was interesting about it. None of our neighbors showed up that night, the first night of our group. None of them showed up. The only person that showed up was this Kamel Haddad, this international criminal that was under the custody of ICE at the time. And so my thought is maybe I won't just, bring him into the house. Maybe I'll just take him. He was there in a taxi. And I just said, why don't we go to Starbucks and we'll meet there? So I drive with him to Starbucks, and we start talking through the material we were looking at. And come to find out, we end up going through the whole small group together, Kamel and I, just him and I. No one else comes to the group. And in the midst of that, Kamel becomes a believer. He gets baptized. And we've actually had some contact off and on. He eventually gives the information, even in talking through this whole thing as a believer. He ends up giving up all the information that ICE agents want to help them shut this thing down at a higher level. They release him with just probation, and he ends up moving to Canada. And through our contacts over the next couple of years, he begins helping a gentleman up there. He start a new church in Canada. He finds anyways, relationally, he had some kids, but he gets married. She's a believer now. Just his whole life is completely different at that point. And he's impacting many, many other people in his work. I mean, he's a phenomenally skilled business person. Obviously, was using it in the wrong way at that time. But needless to say, once it was directed in the right direction, he was able to not just financially help support these church planters up in the Canadian area that was very unreached, but he was a sharp guy himself and was personally helping significantly. But I look at that and I just shake my head thinking, all the best laid plans. I'm thinking we're going to have this great impact in our neighborhood, and all the things we think about. We're inviting all our neighbors, and they're going to receive the gospel, and and none of them show up. And then this international criminal is delivered to our doorstep by a friend, and I get the opportunity to spend several weeks with him, talking through God's purpose and plan in this world and in his life. He trusts Christ and then goes on to impact many other people, all through other places as well. So just a total example of how God's detour in our lives is just a detail oftentimes in his plan as we go through this. So one thing to kind of leave you with on this, here's something I've learned in this journey that I think is so important, is we need to trust God's revealed will in foresight, meaning as we're going forward, we need to trust God's revealed will. That's what we get from the Bible. What does he tell us? What are the general principles we have? Trust them. I think oftentimes as Christians, especially American Christians, I think sometimes we have such a controlled, comfortable environment. We want to know all these things in advance. We tend to try to lean into God's sovereign will going forward, trying to figure out what it is. God, what do you specifically have for me? I want the details. I want to know the exact path. That's his sovereign will for us. And God rarely ever reveals that. He does at times, but very rarely. It's not his mode of operation to tell us what his sovereign will is for us. It is his mode of operation to tell us his revealed will. And we are to use wisdom to apply that in our lives and go forward trusting that. Whether it's a new job or should I move here? Should I marry this person? God's given us his revealed will to say, well, here's the general moral principles that guide those things. Trust that. Don't feel like you need to know the specifics and the exact things, because one, he doesn't reveal it. And secondly, you can't operate outside his sovereign will. I don't understand how that works, but you'll never do anything outside of God's sovereign will. I don't know how that jives with our freedom to make choices. That's just one of those mysteries we won't understand this side of eternity. But what I have learned is you need to move forward. We need to move forward in confidence with the will that he's revealed in his revealed will from his word. And in hindsight, we trust his sovereign will. See, oftentimes we do the opposite. We want the details before we act. And then in hindsight, we want to go back and relive our lives in the past and think, oh, I should have done this. I should have done that. I should have done this. And I'm not saying we shouldn't learn from our mistakes in the past, but we can't lament and continually run them over and over again as if we've somehow missed out on God's greater plan. That's where we have to trust his sovereign will. We have to trust his sovereignty, even in our mistakes, even in the difficult things in life, and learn from it. But just at that point, let it go. We don't know why he allowed it to go the way it did and why it needed to happen in that way in hindsight. But we got to trust his sovereign will in hindsight, knowing he knows what he's doing. And his word says he's working all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Doesn't mean all things are good. It just means that he is working all things together for good. So what does that mean for us? It means that God uses these details in our lives, even bad ones, for his greater good. And I think we see that here in Paul's life, that he is literally in prison for the next several years. Paul is imprisoned. That's not a good thing at all in a person's life personally. But when you see what happens in the book of Acts, that those imprisonments allow Paul to speak to people and share the gospel with people he would have never had access to before. In fact, he's in house arrest for several years with a Roman guards chained to him, or centurions there with him. And that that soldier is hearing the gospel every time people come and visit him. He's in a scenario where people can come and visit him and provide for his needs. He basically has a little church that's being funded by the Roman government. I mean, that's phenomenal in terms of what God was trying to accomplish in his church at that time. Horrible circumstances for Paul that are being used for God's greater good. I think we see that a lot today. In fact, I mentioned earlier that my wife and I watched the movie Selma. I'd encourage you to watch it if you haven't yet, about the march that took place for voting rights. Really, not even voting rights. They already had voting rights as blacks in our country. They just weren't able to actually execute them because they created so many loopholes that made it impossible for them to really actually experience those voting rights. And Martin Luther King Jr. was instrumental in helping overcome that injustice that took place. And what happened in times, oftentimes cost people their lives. And if you watch the movie, you realize the brutality that took place, absolutely horrible. Absolutely, I mean, it just is gut-wrenching. But you also see how those events brought greater good from it. How God does that, I don't understand. He does. And I think that happens at times, and it costs us our lives to do so. It shouldn't in a perfect world. It does in an imperfect one. And as Christians, that should speak to us at times, that we have to be willing to lay down our lives. And knowing that sometimes in the loss of our life, we'll accomplish more than we ever would in the clinging to our lives. I think a little bit of this is happening in the George Floyd death. And I only say this because George was a professing Christian. In fact, if you've read any of his story, he was instrumental in helping a lot of people in the 3rd Ward in the Houston area come to know Jesus. He worked in a very difficult area to lead people to Jesus and to help people out of very difficult circumstances. And I trust that that's true. He was a believer and trusted Jesus. And if that's so, man, he's celebrating. He's in a place right now where he is being overwhelmed with the presence of Jesus. But also, this is something that I think is very interesting, that in George Floyd's death, and even his brother said this at his funeral, his brother said, George Floyd accomplished more in his death than he ever could have in his life. What's happened from this is really going to have lasting impact across our country in a good way. Now, there's been some horrible responses to it, no doubt. But overall, I think a lot of understanding and a lot of good will come from this if we are willing to stop and see that what looks like a detour in this life is a detail in God's plan to bring greater equality and greater acceptance across our nation. And I think many of us would wish we could have accomplished something this significant with our life or even in our death. And I think what looks like a detour is oftentimes a detail in God's perfect plan. So we see that in Paul's life. Paul's a great example, and we know the incredible impact his life had because of how he lived it. And I just want to encourage you today. You may be in the midst of a detour right now. It may be a real long detour. I've had some long detours in my life that I've wondered if they were ever going to end, if I was ever going to get back on the main path at times. And even still, I'm evaluating a detour in my life presently. We are. And just seeing how God is using that and how he's used that to shape and mold us, as well as shape and mold and impact other people through our broken, detoured, oftentimes discouraged lives at those moments. So I want to encourage you today, wherever you're at, don't doubt that God is working significantly and amazingly through your life, and maybe even more so in the midst of a detour than he is when it looks like you're on the main highway. Love you all. I hope you're all doing great. It's so good to have you here this morning. I love just the comments you're shooting out. Anyways, great to have this stuff going on. Hope you guys all are doing well, and can't wait to see you guys all back together. Hey, tune in tonight. I think it's 6:30. You can check our Facebook Live. Brandon got a pretty important message for everyone he's going to be sharing. So make a note of that and come back and check us out and hear what he has to say tonight. You all have a great morning.